Dear colleagues and friends, thank you so much for coming and attending the opening of our international conference, Ethiopians Abroad. And we are, of course, highly pleased and honored to be here in the Pontifical Istituto Orientale. And I just leave the room first to Father David Nazar, who is the rector of the Pontifical Institute, for his welcoming address.
So, honored guests and colleagues, friends, and fellow travelers, welcome to the Pontifical Oriental Institute. It's a particular pleasure to welcome you to the Institute for this opening session of Ethiopians Abroad in the Middle Ages. As you will soon hear from Father Professor Rafal Zarzechny, the Orientale has a long history with Ethiopia, both in terms of scholarly research and in terms of students from Ethiopia and Eritrea. Despite being a small graduate school specialized, each year we have students from as many as 40 different countries. Recently, I gave an interview on the theme of globalization and the role of churches in the diaspora, as we call it. And the journalist was looking primarily for reflections on the effects of immigration from various countries into Western countries, whether the United States or Canada, France, Britain. And what were the effects on those countries of so many immigrants coming in with their languages, traditions, and cultures as an aspect of globalization? And it's a valid question. However, a corollary, a related question is in reverse. And it finds its answer among our students. And this would be the question: what is the effect on students of meeting other cultures and religions when they return to their home country, not when they go to foreign countries? So at the Orientale, for example, a Romanian Byzantine Catholic sits down with an Egyptian Orthodox. A Syro-Malabar student from Kerala becomes friends with a Lebanese Melkite. An Iraqi shares warm experiences with an Iranian. And all of these things happen here. And invariably they find out, to their surprise, that there is much more in common between them and among them than there is that divides them. So the ideologies and politics of our day talk about the divisions, emphasize the divisions, build on the divisions. Whereas actual study and discussion shows that the opposite is more true. There's far more that unites than divides. Hence, we welcome this international symposium that seeks to study and uncover new truths about the history of a great people and their relations with others. May your days in Rome be rich in insight and profitable for a better human understanding. Thank you.
I would like also to thank warmly Father Professor Zarzechny, who guided us to the wonderful treasures of the institutes, and for another short address.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is a great honor for me to join the words of welcome addressed to us by Father David Nazar, rector of this Pontifical Oriental Institute. I am convinced that the international conference, which has been so carefully prepared by the various people and École Française de Rome, in cooperation with our institute, will be truly significantly for the study and research regarding the history of Ethiopians' travel and presence around the medieval and Renaissance world. And I'm already curious to hear and to learn what can we find out. So as for some of the attendees of this conference, this is perhaps their first contact with the Orientale. Please allow me to briefly summarize the scientific output of our institute in the field of Ethiopian studies. From the very beginning, as soon as the Pontifical Orientale Institute was founded in 1917, teaching of Ethiopian language was organized conjointly with the Biblicum. This should not be surprising, as both institutions were entrusted to the Jesuit order. Moreover, even if modern Ethiopian studies have their beginnings in Papal Rome, somewhere in turn of the 15th and 16th century, there have never been here very many specialists in this field. And even if there were some over the last 100 years, they had to be shared with institutions belonging to the Italian state. It's sufficient to mention such eminent scholars associated with various Roman academies as Ignazio Guidi, Carlo Conti Rossini, Enrico Cerulli, and even Stefan Strelzin. The first teacher of the classical Ethiopic language at the Biblicum and Orientale was probably Abba Tekle Mariam Kasai between 1990 and 1922. He was the older brother of Abba Haile Mariam Kasai, the future Catholic bishop and the first native eparch of Ethiopia from 1951. Abba Tekle Mariam, for his part, went to Rome with the first group of the seminarians to the Ethiopian College in the Vatican City and served there as a spiritual director until 1923, when he was appointed as superior of the Ethiopian Hospitium in Jerusalem. Subsequently, the teaching of the classical Ethiopic, Coptic, and Armenian languages was entrusted to Father Alfredo Maria Vitti, professor of the New Testament at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. After him, there was Jean Simon, another Jesuit father who was the professor of Oriental languages at the Biblicum and Orientale from 1932. He was also an expert on hagiography, and in 1938 he accompanied Louis Théophile Lefort in his exploration of the Pachomian monastic cities in Egypt. Among Simon's early publications, we find the first repertorium of public and private libraries holding Egyptian manuscripts. Then an edition of Ethiopic Passio of Saint Abraham and this of Saint Heroda, the Egyptian martyrs, with their French translations. Some important notice added by him to the Guidi's Storia della Letteratura Etiopica will be followed later by Cerulli and Ricci. Later, Jean Simon prepared an extended recension of the contendings of the apostles by Sir Wallis Budge. In the same year appeared his review of Zena Ayhud, an Ethiopic translation throughout the Arabic text of the Hebrew book of Yosipon, the document that Simon rightly recognized as relevant and requiring in-depth study. We can only regret that apart from few references in publications dedicated to the Ethiopian chronicles and Apocrypha, Simon's work has found no imitators to this day. Contrary his notes to the Chrestomatia Ethiopica, after 80 years from the publication, remain still a valuable source of bibliographic references to the text edited by Dillman. Finally, Jean-Simon composed an Ethiopian bibliography for the years 1946 to 51, intended as a continuation of the works initiated by Fumagalli and Zanutto. An equally extensive list of publications in Ethiopian matters had to wait probably until the Abing's bibliography. It is also worth remembering that in the new series of the Orientale journal under Simon's direction, many important studies and Ethiopian texts were edited by Cerulli, Grebo, Euringer, and others. All of us know very well the name of William Francis Macomber. The value of his pioneering work in the field of cataloging Ethiopian manuscripts, photographed by MML project, cannot be overestimated. As we remember, the first 3 volumes were compiled entirely by Macomber, while the volumes 5th, 6th, and 7th are the fruit of his collaboration with Getachew Haile. However, only a few people remember that Macomber was strictly connected to the Orientale. It is here that he compiled his specialist studies and wrote his doctorate thesis, publicly discussed in 1963, exactly in this place. Subsequently, Macomber was a professor of liturgy at the Pio. His strong Orientalist interests are well attested by his outstanding publications at that time regarding especially the Syriac matters. And there are many, many important titles which I have to skip. In 1974 only, he went to St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota, to work on the new Ethiopian manuscript microfilm library as its first cataloger. Later, he was involved in several microfilming projects by Brigham Young University, dedicated, among others, to the manuscripts of Jerusalem, as well as to these belonging to the Orientale. In 1985, Macomber contributed to the catalogue of Syriac, Ethiopic, and Armenian manuscripts from the Franciscans Centre d'études orientales chrétiennes of Cairo. The third scholar in Ethiopian matters connected to the Orientale I want to mention today is Monsignor Osvaldo Raineri. In fact, he was a professor of Ethiopic language and Ethiopian matters at the Pontifical Oriental Institute for almost 40 years, since 1983. The large number of his publications does not allow me to list even the most important ones. So I will limit myself to highlight only a few that can be related to the historical topic of the current conference. These are, above all, the articles written by Raineri on the history of the Church and the hospice of Santo Stefano dei Mori in the Vatican City, portraying on this occasion the people who played a significant role in Ethiopian studies conducted in Rome over the centuries. A series of such Raineri's publications begins with his article dedicated to Abba Georgis Zegalabada, an Ethiopian monk and rector of the St. Stephen Church at the beginning of 19th century. Subsequently, some his articles dealing with the first Ethiopian printings in Rome appeared. So we receive, among others, a paper dedicated to Pietro Bembo, and the first editing of the St. Paul's letters. Another, and dedicated to Carmelitan Father Jacob Wemers, and his first Latin lexicon of Ge'ez. A note regarding Remedius Prudki and his journey to Ethiopia in the middle of 18th century. Finally, an obituary note about Abba Petros Hailu of Hebbo, an Ethiopian monk active in Rome, appeared in 1986. But what could be remembered today particularly, it is the correspondence between the Roman popes and Ethiopian kings from 12th to 20th century, edited and translated by Monsignor Raineri in 2003 and reworked by him in 2005. The Pontifical Orientale Institute continues to be a home for Ethiopian studies also today. The Ethiopic Classical Language Lecture is currently organized on 2 levels, and it is still a common course for the Orientale and Biblicum. Moreover, we offer regular courses on Ethiopian liturgy and history of the Church, which are accompanied by introductory courses to the Christian civilization of Ethiopia and Eritrea, or those devoted to the classical literature, monastic tradition, archaeology, and hagiography. Individual courses on Ethiopian paleography and codicology are offered too. Furthermore, we continue to work closely with the Vatican Library and offer our help in cataloging and studying Ethiopian manuscripts in their collections. Over the past 100 years, dozens of studies in Ethiopian theology, history, and literature have been published in our journal Orientalia Christiana Periodica, alongside numerous editions of the Ethiopic text and their translations. Similarly, the Orientalia Christiana Analecta monographic series opened its doors for some Ethiopic works, such as a study on the Christology of Ethiopian Church by Abba Ayele Tekle Haimanot, also known as Mario of Abiadi, in 1956, or the bibliography of the Ethiopian liturgy by Habte Mikael Kidane, 2008, who presented Habte Mikael Kidane his PhD thesis at the Orientale in 1991. Finally, a catalogue of 175 Ethiopian manuscripts with a comparative repertory of included texts was published by me just 2 years ago. In 2015, first symposium on Ethiopian studies was held at our institute. It was connected to the presentation of a Jubilee book for Osvaldo Raineri. This extensive volume contains more than 30 valuable studies, to which many of you have contributed, mostly on Ethiopian literature, history, and art. Furthermore, Abba Tedros Abraha, apart from many of his liturgical studies and biblical text editions, has recently published the homilies of Severus of Ashmunaim in the prestigious series Patrologia Orientalis, edited at our institute under the direction of Father Philippe Louisier. And no one needs to be reminded how many important texts have appeared in this series, notably the Ethiopian Synaxary or numbers living lives of Ethiopian saints. Separately, it is worth mentioning that the centenary of the Vatican Ethiopian College was also celebrated here in 2019. The library of the Institute, which from its very beginning meticulously collects what we need to study the history, literature, dogma, linguistics, spirituality, liturgy, and canon law of the Eastern churches, does not neglect to care for the publications related to the tradition of Ethiopia and Eritrea. Thus, some rare editions of books are properly stored, such as the Latin lexicon published by Hiob Ludolf in 1661 and on display today, together with Ethiopic Psalter, edited by him in 1693, the original copy, apart from the Biblia Polyglotta or some individually numbered copies of the books by Sir Wallis Budge, the font of Aula, extremely rare and reach exorbitant prices in antique shops and at auctions. Several modern editions and periodicals printed in Ethiopia and Eritrea are collected here as well, that are probably not available in other Western libraries, not to mention the usual tools used by every scholar. I think I can assure you that our library remains sincerely open to all the specialized in Ethiopian matters, and that you will find here everything you need for your scientific work in that field. Ladies and gentlemen, the symposium that we are starting today fits perfectly into the Institute's shining tradition as a true center of scientific research and study. We hope that the papers we will listen to will broaden our knowledge, and by their relevance, they will help the people living on the Horn of Africa to protect and develop the richness of their own heritage and memory. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Father Professor Zazeshny, for this introduction, intellectual introduction to the field. And you have already opened our works with this presentation. You have highlighted the prominent role the PO have played and still is playing in the field of Ethiopian literature and more broadly Ethiopian studies. And you have also already drawn the map of our conference, highlighting probably the main places where Ethiopians abroad are visible in our sources and are to be studied from our sources. Of course, Jerusalem, Rome, but also, most and foremost, Egypt, Cairo, maybe Ashmonain, I don't know, probably. And I should add also Hamburg for different reasons. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Alessandro Bausi. I warmly thank him. Yeah, please come, Professor, for accepting to give the keynote lecture of our conference. Everybody knows Professor Bausi, who is professor in Ethiopian Studies at Hamburg Universität and also director of the Herb Ludolf Center for Ethiopian Studies, and who is, of course, a prominent specialist in Ethiopic literature and manuscript cultures and history of Ethiopian Christianism. Before leaving you the room, I just want to add a word in the memory of an old friend who was a librarian of the Holy Family Collegium in Cairo, Père Maurice Martin, who wrote, I think, pioneering studies on the author and the figure you will address today, meaning Johann Michael van Sleben. And he would have loved to be with us today and to listen to your lecture. Thank you very much for this lecture, Lost and Found in Egypt and the East, the contribution to Ethiopian studies of Johann Michael van Sleben.
Many thanks, and let me first address the rector of the Pontifical Oriental Institute, Professor David Nazar, Professor Rafał Jajeczny, Professor Jean Loiseau, dear colleagues and attendants of this conference, ladies and gentlemen. I would like first to extend my warm thanks to the organizers of this most welcome conference on Ethiopians abroad in the Middle Ages, and my most sincere thanks go to Professor Loiseau, principal investigator of the ERC project Hornist. My warmest thanks also go to Dr. Martina Ambu, with whom in particular I've corresponded for the occasion of this conference. Many thanks again, Martina, for all you did. Let me also express how honored I feel to be invited to a conference held at these two prestigious host institutions, the Pontifical Oriental Institute and the École Française de Rome. While it is my first time that I have the honor to be involved in an initiative of the École, I remember with pleasure that at the PIO, I had the opportunity not only to study for quite some time when I was commuting between Florence and Naples, stopping many times in Rome just to have the benefit of consulting this wonderful and unique library. But I had also the opportunity to talk now, over 20 years ago, at a conference on Saint Clement held here, and the proceedings of which were edited by Professor Philippe Louisier in a volume of Orientale Christiana Analecta, as it has been mentioned already. And I have to say that my contribution there is not entirely unrelated to the topic I'm going to deal with today. Probably also because, as sometimes it happens, I've been dealing always with the same topics for over 35 years, in fact, and I wonder whether I should be proud of this. Yet the opportunity to talk again about this topic, that is the contribution to Ethiopian studies of Johann Michael van Sleben, I owe to the kind suggestion of the organizer, so don't put the blame on me, so to say, who actually assigned it to me with great benevolence, having an eye at my not a few commitments. I'm surely aware of this, so thus sparing me the burden of preparing a contribution, a completely fresh topic, for which I have to confess I wouldn't have been able to find the time. In Johann Michael van Sleben, in fact, I've been interested since decades, starting from the narrow angle of his own manuscripts, especially those preserved in Florence, some of which, as I will show, he copied in Egypt. And in a still little documented period of his life he spent in Italy, between Florence and Rome. I resumed the topic quite some intervals and had the opportunity to rethink about it. The topic, in fact, is still quickly developing, as I will show, and fundamental contributions have happened again just months ago, with one scholar, above all contributing to it, that is Alastair Hamilton, with whom I had the privilege to correspond also on the topic. So as grateful as I am to the organizers for all this, I beg your pardon, this presentation will appear just a repetition at times of what is already well known. Yet, at times, it takes long before balanced assessments take ground. And I have no text, and I will use the presentation that you can see, I hope, just to fix some points during my presentation, which due to last 1 hour, I think, risk to be really too boring. So Johann Michael Vansleben, or other spellings are attested, Vanslebio, and other German variants, was born in 1635 in Sommerde, Erfurt, and not far from Gotha, and he died in 1679 in France, in Bouron, close to Fontainebleau. For everyone who wants to get really an immediate idea of his figure and activity, there is a wonderful website, Manuscript Hunters, developed by Nadice Urbicek. I don't know if I pronounce the name correct, but really go there and you will find that almost all my slides have been copied from that website, more or less. But first of all, the general study. So from where we can know more about this quite peculiar figure? Well, for everyone, this is mandatory reading. 2 main contributions by Alastair Hamilton. The first one from 2018 is the edition of the Italian version of his travels in the Levant. And quite a few months ago, it has appeared along with Moritz van den Bogert, the annotated edition of his French report, which complements the previous report. Particularly the first volume, the preface, so the first 60 pages of the first volume provides really a wonderful overview on everything related to Vansleben, and it should be taken as the new, fresh starting point. Just to mention a couple of other ongoing works on him, I mention here a study which is largely neglected, because it doesn't say really that it has to do with Vansleben. And this is the study by Horn, something arisen in the framework of the TABO, Tübinger Atlas des Vorderen Orients project, which while studying the Christian topography of Egypt, actually draws extensively on the works of Vansleben, both published and unpublished, even though the author was not able to let's say, consult everything. I have to mention also the contribution by Robin Seignobos, or Seignobos, I don't know, Seignobos, thank you, who really has valued some of the materials collected by Vansleben for the study of lists of bishops. And this is accessible, I think, also on academia in this quite valuable study. Then I have to mention a sort of ghost conference of which the proceedings never appear, a conference held in, as you can see, in Gotha in 2015. Actually, I took part also in this conference. Then I immediately realized that here nothing was going to be published, and I published my contribution 1 year later in another series, as I will mention now. But still, it is these contributions about Job Ludolf and Johann Michael Vansleben, Oriental Studies, Politics and History between Gotha and Africa, promised to be an important contribution, but still nobody knows when it will appear. So 5 years ago, it was given as forthcoming. So why should I be entitled to say something on Michael Vansleben? You see, really at the very beginning of my output, if I can say so, I published a small catalog of the Ethiopic manuscripts of Vansleben preserved in Florence, in the National Library of Florence. It was one of my first articles published in 1989. But then I came back to his findings when addressing a text, the Epistle 70 of Cyprian, which for me was a sort of eye-opening, because it was the first text transmitted within the Synodos, which really showed evidence of a Greek forlage. And I went back to the literature concerning this text, which is transmitted also in well-known manuscripts, for example, manuscript cataloged by Grébeau and others, just to realize that nobody has used the conspectus, so one of the few works explicitly dedicated to Ethiopic studies by Johann Michael van Sleben, but I will come back to this later. I worked also on the Garla Hawariat, the Apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, of which also a manuscript was documented by van Sleben during his stays in Egypt. He copied a manuscript which is now preserved in Florence. And finally, in 2015, I published this contribution, so Johann Michael van Sleben's manuscripts and texts, an update in a supplement to Ethiopica volume, where I tried to provide an as wide as possible update on his manuscripts in the widest meaning. And of course, studying this text of the Epistle 70 of Cyprian involved a complete rethinking also of the start, the beginning of a complete rethinking of the canon law collections in Ethiopic. So the Synodos, but also what in the Synodos belongs to an earlier layer. And I addressed this topic also, that's why I mentioned it in the contribution published for the conference on St. Clement held here at Pio. So van Sleben is a figure which is full of paradoxes, because he was destined at the beginning of his career to explore and study Ethiopia. He has been a formidable contributor on the East, Turkey, Egypt, and the Copts in particular, as far as publications are concerned, while he published very little on Ethiopia and Ethiopic, while instead everyone expected from him that he did that. He was supported by Protestants, and strongly supported by Protestants, by Ludolf and the Herzog of Gotha, while instead he converted to Catholicism when he was in Rome and in Italy, for reasons which are still discussed, which were in fact the reasons for his conversion to Catholicism. He provided a huge amount of Greek and Oriental manuscripts, almost 600, to France when he was in the service of Colbert. But again, he was personally particularly interested in Ethiopic manuscripts and texts, and throughout his career he always voiced that this was really his strong point. So his engagement with Ethiopic textual heritage, we can assume, was even superior to that of experienced by Ludolf, his mentor and lastly denigrator, who missed essential points of van Sleben's contribution. He participated also in intellectual discourse of the time. For example, he copied a manuscript on republicanism following the ideas of Harrington's, the author of Oceana, so a work which supported republicanism in Britain. And so this is something which is a relatively fresh discovery and completely unexpected in a figure like van Sleben. And there are still sources and manuscripts concerning his life which have not been used as much as they could. Now, here I have a sort of chronological orders, the career of van Sleben, but I will go fast and I will skip some of them. Maybe you can also read something. As we said, he was born in Erfurt, and he is the son of a Lutheran pastor, and while instead his brother was a Catholic priest, so an interesting constellation in his family. And we have not to forget that just a few years later, we have the epochal visit of Abba Gorgorios in Germany, invited by Hiob Ludolf, so Abba Gorgorios, who died in 1659, was really a main figure and the main informant, also co-author, and some like to say, of Hiob Ludolf. Of course, everything started in Rome, as we know, because Ludolf had met Abba Gregorius in Rome in 1649. He had a regular academic career. He studied Oriental languages also at the University of Königsberg, even though we don't know exactly how many Oriental languages he studied. We know, for example, that his Greek was weak. Some also say that his Latin was weak, and maybe Oriental language meant only Hebrew, maybe a bit of Syriac, but nothing more than that. Certainly not Samaritan and so on, like some sources report. He served then as a soldier, and he was very much interested in a practical career. So he was interested in the events of his times. And he served first for 1 year as a soldier before trying to find out a career as a dealer in Amsterdam. But this was not possible due to his bad Dutch. You might ask, how do we know all these things? Well, Van Sleben was used to keep a journal. And up to the beginning of his first travel to Egypt, he reported himself a lot of information that we can really read in this journal. The main point in his career was his encounter with Job Ludolf, so the great intellectual, the great personality of Ethiopian studies. And we have to say that if Ludolf received Van Sleben as student in Ethiopic, dedicating to him time in order to instruct him in his house in Gotha, this means that also Van Sleben had to be, to some extent, a very promising scholar. And so promising he was that Ludolf committed to him to take care of the edition, which intended to have published in London, of his Lexicon Ethiopico Latinum, as well as to copy Ethiopic texts from the libraries in the nearby area. So it happened that in September 1660, Van Sleben leaves Gotha for London and works for Ludolf in this capacity. He worked also for Edmund Castell, who was editing a lexicon heptaglotton, which is considered a masterpiece of Oriental studies, one of the first multilingual dictionaries ever published. And here you see the frontispiece of the result of this editorial activity Van Sleben carried out in London, the first edition of the Lexicon Ethiopico Latinum, with a grammar, and then also with the additions of other parts under the name of Johann Michael Van Sleben. Ludolf, among his many attacks against Van Sleben after Van Sleben had died, mentions repeatedly the many errors and the unacceptable changes which Van Sleben did to this lexicon. Having spoken with colleagues, for example, even with Professor Stefan Wening, really nobody understands exactly which were these incredible mistakes that were done in this lexicon. So this is something that should be studied very carefully in order to understand what was behind that. He returns to Erfurt, and definitely we must assume, encouraged by the performance offered by Van Sleben in London, Van Sleben was requested by the Duke of Saxe-Gotha, a fervent Protestant, to undertake a first journey to Egypt and actually beyond Egypt. So the idea is that of sending Van Sleben in Egypt as a first gateway to Ethiopia. And we know that which were the steps of this journey. So first Livorno, Leghorn, then Alexandria, and then in January 1664, the arrival in Egypt. We have the detailed instructions which Van Sleben received from Ludolf and the Duke Ernst of Saxe-Gotha, which are preserved in manuscript form. There, he also started quite promisingly because he spends 3 weeks in Alexandria, meets the Coptic community, goes to Cairo, he meets Matthew IV, Patriarch of Alexandria, and even though, well, he had health problems, but he was able to spend 2 months in the Coptic monastery of St. Anthony, and he makes copies and acquired several manuscripts. While he copied Ethiopic manuscripts, he was able to acquire a number of Arabic manuscripts. Some of these are preserved now due to the circumstances which I'm going to illustrate in a moment, also in Florence at the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale. So they yes, in 1665, after actually having arrived in Langhorn, so Van Sleben writes the foundations and model of a perfect commonwealth, or Oceana. So a summary of James Harrington's political theory. And this is probably due to the encounter during his way back in Leghorn of Charles Longland, who introduced him to these political conceptions. These, so to say, political excursus and interests of Van Sleben are a completely new aspects of his personality and are due to the discovery by a French scholar of a manuscript in 2013, preserved in the library of Poitiers. At the moment, nothing was known about this, let's say, reflections, which shows which were the real interests of Van Sleben, or at least the variety of interests of Van Sleben beyond manuscripts, the church, and so on. He, after Leghorn, which was part of course of the area of the Granducato, Van Sleben stays in Florence 4 months, and there copies Ethiopic manuscripts from the libraries, and particularly from manuscripts which are now in the Biblioteca Medicea Laurenziana, and in particular one manuscript on which I will come back because it's a very important manuscript of the Synodos, of the canon law collection. But first, let me finish this sort of short biography. He passed then in Rome, probably under advice of the Medici Grand Duke, and first stayed at the Maronite College, meeting peoples like Athanasius Kircher, so first-rate intellectuals of the time, and also Don Pietro, an Abyssinian of the Collegio di Santo Stefano, or Santo Stefano dei Mori, let's call it Collegio at the time, whom he will meet later in Cairo during his second travel to Egypt. Again, he spends his time visiting all the Roman libraries, which are extremely rewarding for him, and copying a number of further manuscripts. In March 1667, he converts to Catholicism, and in January 1668, he enters the Dominican convent of Santa Maria sopra Minerva. And for the rest of his life, he will always call himself Ordinis Predicatorum. So he will really state that was his belonging. In 1670, he moves to Paris, probably not immediately called by Colbert, but due to some personal collections. And in 1671, there are 2 important printed contributions by Van Sleben. The first one is the Relazione dello Stato Presente dell'Egitto, as you immediately realize, written in Italian. We have to say something also on the language of Van Sleben. I remember when we were writing the entry for the Encyclopedia Ethiopica, first drafted by Volber Smith, I had to spend quite a lot of time to convince him that it was not a translation, because Van Sleben was used to write Italian. And actually, the correspondence with Colbert is half French and half Italian, as one can immediately read in the Aumons monumental work dedicated to the genesis of the funds of the Paris libraries. So this was, it's written in Italian, which was, as it has been suggested by Tommasino, who is an expert of travel literatures of the 17th century, a sort of Italiano odeporico. So it was the language purposely chosen to narrate travels, particularly in the Levant. It worked to some extent as a lingua franca. We know that this Italian was revised also by the help of Italians and also by Marucelli, so the founder of the Biblioteca Marucelliana in Florence. It was dedicated to Cosimo III, successor of Ferdinand II. But Ferdinand II, the Grand Duke, was really the one who had opened him the doors of the Florentine libraries and introduced him also to the libraries in Rome. We have a number of manuscripts which are related to this first travel. And I don't want now to really to spend so much time on this because we are still at slide 17. But just to mention some, you can read maybe just the shelf marks. In Gotha, Forschungsbibliothek, there is also a German account of the first travel to Egypt. We have to keep in mind that Wansleben still, after the conversion, kept on corresponding with Ludolf. And he had also sent to him a sort of parallel relazione, so report on Egypt, which is at variance in some points, as far as theological concepts are concerned, with the version which he committed to print in the Italian version. Other manuscripts are preserved, and another one which I will skip now, which shows, however, the intense exchange of these reports, copied and recopied by several scholars. And as you can see here in the note, very often recurs the name of Horn, the author which I mentioned at the beginning, who used all these unpublished manuscripts just in order to collect place names of Christian Egypt. So he used these unpublished sources in order to design a sort of Christian topography of Egypt. And this shows the great importance of the works published and unpublished which Wansleben carried out during his travel. I will skip this really because it's too much. Some manuscripts are preserved also in the British Library. And again, one more manuscript of the German version, and this is still unpublished. And a manuscript containing, one more manuscript in the British Library containing an Italian version of the first report. We would need a critical edition of all this in order to understand exactly what is in the German version, what is the printed Italian version, was in the still manuscript Italian versions still only available in manuscript forms, so really. For some of these manuscripts in the British Library, we can also trace the history. This is, for example, an excerpt from the work by Targioni Tozzetti, dedicated to the library belonged to Antonio Cocchi. And I draw your attention just to the end, where he says that of this good religious person, so Wansleben, among the manuscripts of the Biblioteca Magliabechiana, so the nucleus of what would become the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale di Firenze, are preserved various studies and various collections of holy antiquities, and works which belong particularly to the religion and liturgy of the Abyssinians or Copts. And this is an important testimony that at the time the manuscripts by Wansleben were already in this fund, which would later become the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale di Firenze. It is interesting also, and I think this is a small discovery which I claim to have done, that among the people with whom he corresponded, there is also Francesco Redi, And you might wonder, who was this Francesco Redi? Francesco Redi is really a great character because he was a scientist as well as a humanist, as it was common at the time. And the first one who was against the so-called spontaneous generation, who demonstrated that, of course, there is no spontaneous generation, that you need human beings in order to have other human beings. There is nothing which comes from nothing. And Francesco Redi corresponded with Van Sleben. We have letters of his also during his later period. And again, towards the end of this passage, we read that, says Francesco Redi, I had in my hands also, from the hands of Johann Michael Van Sleben, when he came back from Egypt, a small booklet in Arabic language where there are written such useless things. And he refers here to all the amulets and magical prayers and everything which is used in order to protect against firearms and other offensive and other weapons. And he says also, and I saw also written in Ethiopian languages, and other examples among the manuscripts of the Grand Duke. So it's an interesting connection, and we should exploit really the archive of the Accademia del Cimento, founded by Galileo Galilei, to whom Francesco Redi belonged, in order to see if there is anything which is not yet known. And here a passage from a letter addressed to Van Sleben in Aleppo, that is during his second travel, about which I will say something. But I wanted to anticipate this because Francesco Redi belongs to the people he met in Florence, so during this Italian interlude. And here there is a passage where Redi says that he's very happy that Van Sleben has found so many ancient manuscripts also in Ethiopic language. To be honest, as is well known, among all the manuscripts that Van Sleben collected and sent to France, there was only one Ethiopic manuscript. So all the other manuscripts were in other languages. So this remains a bit mysterious, what really Van Sleben had written to Redi in order for Redi to react in such a way. I said that alongside the Relazione, in 1671, we have the publication of this Conspectus Operum Aethiopicorum. What does this mean? It is a sort of overview of all the Ethiopic works which Van Sleben claims he was ready to have printed. So it's a list of works ready to be printed. And it is a small publication, just 24 pages, on which I will come back later, because this is extremely interesting in the way that the stuff is distributed. But now let's come to the second journey to the east of Van Sleben. We said he's in France at the service of Colbert and, in the end, King Louis XIV. And through Pierre de Carcavie, a mathematician and a librarian, Colbert gave instructions to Van Sleben to leave for the East, and that's the point, very uncertain, either to collect simply manuscripts or also to reach Ethiopia. And there is some confusion here about the instructions which Van Sleben received. Had he really to go to Ethiopia and only to Ethiopia, as probably Colbert expected, or was he instead sent to the East just to collect manuscripts due to his great familiarity in Arabic and other languages, and for having already carried out a travel in those areas? In any case, Van Sleben leaves, and well, I will not go through all the steps, but starting from June 1671, he sends manuscripts to Colbert. So he's able to acquire manuscripts, and from the various places where he goes, Larnaca, Cyprus, Tripoli, in Syria, Lebanon, and then Aleppo, regularly sending large batches of manuscripts, 94 volumes, for example, from Aleppo in 1671. From Aleppo, he goes to Damascus. He visits the Melkite convent of Saidnaya, and a famous, let's say, visit, because this takes quite a lot of space in the second report which he published. Then Damascus, Sidon, and regularly shipments of books to France, and finally, again, in Egypt, 18 March 1672. Here, what is important is that he met also the draftsman Onorato Leonardo Iatro, who provided for him a series of drawings which illustrate actually his report and are of high archaeological importance for documenting archaeological sites and monuments of Egypt. He visited Fayoum. He keeps on sending manuscripts to France. He visited the White and Red Monastery, and also the monastery of St. Anthony, again, close to the Red Sea. I try to be a bit faster. He moves then towards Turkey again, and is in Izmir, and finally also in Constantinople, and making further excursions. Back in Chios, in this place, there is an important event in his life, because as he reports, les lundis, so 17 de mois, il m'arriva une malheureuse affaire, dont le souvenir me fait encore hérisser les cheveux. Il s'agit soit de perdre le tout. What was it? What happened to Vasleben here? Well, there are various hypotheses. I just report one of the speculation, let's say, of Alastair Hamilton. Probably he was involved in a prostitution affair, and this became to some extent known and would cause a lot of troubles to him also in the future, adding, let's say, to the rumors which were put on him of being a man of, let's say, little moral, let's say, obligations. In any case, this cannot be taken for certain, just a hypothesis. Back in Constantinople, he keeps on sending books, but he also used this time to write the Histoire de l'Église d'Alexandrie, so one of his masterpieces, and probably the most important works that he published. As we will see also of this work, the editorial history is quite complex, because this is the French translation, French version which is published, but there are other versions which have not yet been used. So, finally, he returned to France, and he arrived in Paris in 1676, and he spent quite almost 2 years in the Dominican convent in the Rue Saint-Jacques, but actually have been welcomed extremely coldly by Colbert. So everyone was disappointed about him, even though he was convinced that the opposite should happen, because he had been able really to send a lot of manuscripts to Colbert. And well, the reasons for this I will discuss maybe at the end. Here, the frontispiece of his work, the Histoire de l'Église d'Alexandrie. Of course, the PO has the original edition of everything, so also of this work, which was shown to me just 1 hour ago. No, I saw it. Father Louisier showed it. History? Yes. I don't know if he's here, but no, I saw it. He told me that he never used the PDF, which is trivial, and of course, and he always wants to use the printed paper edition. By the way, also this work has been dealt with quite it's very curious that Fumagalli, which was mentioned for having compiled an essential bibliography up to 1893 or 91, let's say, of everything published on Ethiopia, gives a completely wrong description of this work, because this is a commented bibliography, the one in Fumagalli. And Fumagalli says, there is the broad analysis of the very precious manuscript, Laurentian manuscripts of the councils in Ethiopic, on which see Assemanni, so the author of the catalogue of the Biblioteca Medicia Laurenziana. So actually, Fumagalli, there is nothing on this manuscript in the Histoire de l'Église d'Alexandrie. And so there is no other explanation than Fumagalli confused the conspectus with the history, with the Histoire, because in the conspectus there is exactly the analysis of this manuscript. It's quite surprising that this work has been so badly treated in Ethiopian studies, so to say. As you see, other manuscripts related to this second travel of Van Sleben. So first, a manuscript preserved in the BNF in Paris, notizie intorno alla Chiesa Alessandrina, and this appears to be an Italian version of the Histoire, actually. But we have also a manuscript, just mentioned in a small footnote by Alastair Hamilton, the manuscript from Oxford, Marshall 18, which is again an Italian version of the Histoire, La Chiesa Alessandrina fondata da San Marco, and so on, as you can see. I skipped the details. You can find a description on the website of the Bodleian Library. In the same, so in 1677, he published also a Nouvelle Relation d'un voyage fait en Égypte. Again, one of the best contemporary studies on Egypt, and this time really in France. This work was immediately published in English, showing to some extent also the international appeal of Van Sleben. And it was republished, I think it's the only case of a work which was republished at least before the 20th century in 1698, again in Paris. Related to this second travel, however, we have very important manuscripts which complement this second report. The first one is this one, the BNF Italien 435, which is the subject of Hamilton's book. So Hamilton's book of 2018 is just the annotated and commented edition of this manuscript. Well, I will skip this because, let's say there are other manuscripts which also can be related to these documents. And one is, again, a manuscript in the BNF, 4193, which is important for the role that he played on the future fortune of Van Sleben. Because Van Sleben, this manuscript was thoroughly used by Louis Poujois, who is the one who rehabilitated Van Sleben already in the 19th century, dedicated a thorough monograph to his life. So, and among the manuscripts which is used, there is also this manuscript. But I want to come to more important points, and I think that time is also running, so I will have to shorten. In any case, this manuscript, a continuation of the Nouvelle Relation, is the subject of the last monograph publications on Van Sleben. So the book by Hamilton and Van den Bogert just appeared so Johann Michael van Sleben's travels in Turkey, which is not covered in his Nouvelle Relation. Yeah, other manuscripts, but really I will skip this because it's too much. And let's come to the end of his very short life. So in disgrace and having received as a source of living just the function of vicar in the parish of Bouron, he first started his service there in 1678, and he died there in 1679, just aged 43. Curiously, after his death, there appeared a work which is still discussed, because this is, as you can see, the very polemic title, A Brief Account of the Rebellions and Bloodshed Occasioned by the Anti-Christian Practices of the Jesuits and Other Popish Emissaries in the Empire of Ethiopia. So a very strong anti-Catholic book appeared in London, but put under the name of Van Sleben. It is still uncertain to what extent this publication used just the name of Van Sleben, or really is just a forgery. So here also a thorough study would be needed, because as also Hamilton remarks, aside from the tone, the facts which are narrated are quite exact. It's not really an invention. So the reports concerning the Jesuit mission to Ethiopia correspond more or less to what actually happened. So it's a mystery what really this book, what is behind this book. In 1794, so much later, also the German version of his travels appeared, the first report and the second report, one after the other, in the collection Sammlung der merkwürdigsten Reisen in den Orient. And here just a maps, but you know where this place are, which shows so to some extent the area of activity of Van Sleben. There are other manuscripts which are related to his activity. I will just mention again the manuscript from Poitiers, where this political work by James Harrington is half copied or summarized. As I said, this was discovered by Thérèse Marie Geilly and described along with other contributions in a monograph from 2013. And it is also here quite unclear if this manuscript was just one of a set of 8 manuscripts. So that would mean that there are other manuscripts dispersed also by Van Sleben, or if it is not the case. There are various interpretations related to the description in an action catalog, and I have my opinion, and Geilly has another opinion. So I'm not sure that that there were really 8 manuscripts. But in any case, I have to mention this. And then there are the manuscripts copied by Van Sleben. And as I said, the first one, for example, the Benef Ethiopian 76, have to do with this, with the tasks which he received from Ludolf of copying and transmitting to him everything which was available in Ethiopic. And for most of the manuscript, we can reconstruct quite precisely the models which Van Sleben used. Another manuscript preserved in Frankfurt, Collectana Ethiopica, and in many cases these manuscripts were later annotated by Ludolf. So we have 2 hands, the first one by Van Sleben and the other one by Ludolf. Another one in Cambridge. I will skip this one because are less important for me. And I will mention only this one, 153, because this manuscript is found in Paris, but it has the note that this manuscript had been donated to the Grand Duke of Tuscany. So, since we have the same note in the 5 manuscripts preserved in Florence, one has to wonder why this manuscript didn't have the same fate and instead is now found in Florence. Probably because at some point Van Sleben decided to keep this manuscript for himself. This is what I would suggest. In any case, among these manuscripts, we have these 5 manuscripts preserved in Florence, the ones I catalogued in 1989. And as you can see, these manuscripts are at times written at intervals. So the first one, for example, is a composite, or let's say, I would call this really a miscellaneous manuscript more than a composite, because it was copied partly and written partly in Egypt, from Cairo, and partly in Rome. The second one was copied partly in Florence and partly in Rome, the other one in London and Rome, and the fourth one in Egypt, Qusqam, of Dair al-Muharrak, and Rome, and the last one also in Cairo and Dair al-Muharrak. So this, as I said, brings us the Van Sleben à la tâche, so to say, working on Ethiopic texts. And it is interesting, a passage that he wrote in the Relazione dello Stato Presente dell'Egitto, where he says that he could not find many Ethiopic manuscripts in Cairo, because the Abyssinians were obliged to sell their goods and also their manuscript books. And these books, which were about 40, were then sent by, he says, Padre Elzearo Cappuccino al Gran Cancelliere di Francia, Monsignor Pierre Seguier. So these manuscripts actually, this is an important information concerning the origin of some of the oldest manuscripts preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And I have to say that this was not noted by Claire Bostiessé when she wrote quite recently a nice article on the Ethiopian manuscripts and the origin of the old fund of manuscripts in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. That this is really a very precious information concerning the origin of these manuscripts. So, and I have already said that so these manuscripts now in Florence have a quite tormented origin. As I said, he spent time when he was in Rome and in Florence as well, of course, to visit the libraries and to copy manuscripts. There is also the hypothesis that he drafted a sort of catalog of manuscripts in the Vatican Library. This is what my reports, but I don't think that this is proved. This is Dair al-Muharrak, just to show one of the southernmost places where Van Sleben moved. Actually, he went then a bit further to the south, just to... I will come back to the Florence manuscripts in a moment, if I'm not running out of time, but I would like to know if Father Giagetni, 10 minutes. Okay, so sorry for being so long. There are biblical manuscripts, the well-known Ethiopian 1 and 2. There is a manuscript of the book of the mystery of heaven and earth, which was for some time also confused with the book of Enoch. And we have also manuscripts in Bern, in the Burber Bibliothek, which testifies to his activities. These have been more or less all well catalogued. This, for example, by Veronica Six. There are other manuscripts, but I don't want to really to spend too much more time. Just a focus on these 5 manuscripts because they have a close connection to Egypt. And Particularly, the Maglia Becchiano third four contain a collection of apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, the model of which, copied in Egypt, the model of which cannot be determined. And this is important because it means that the manuscript witness preserve all its, let's say, value. And we have also a manuscript with two collections of the miracles of Mary. One manuscript, the third 83, with two different collections. The manuscript was studied by Cerulli, but let's say only for one of the collections, the antigraph has been detected later. And Cerulli wrote an article in 1956 on two manuscripts from the Uppsala library. And the fact is that not only this manuscript, but also other manuscripts were copied from Ethiopic manuscripts that now are preserved in Uppsala, because they were bought in Cairo after Van Sleben had copied them by Henrik Benzelius. And so, we have the catalog by Löfgren, which details all this connection. I will end with this sort of obsession of the Book of the Synods, which appears as one of the really enduring interests of Van Sleben. The manuscript Magliabecchiano Terzo 2 is a book of the Synodos. And part of the manuscript was copied from a manuscript now preserved in the Laurenziana, the Orientale 148, a very interesting manuscript, of course, because it comes from Jerusalem. It has the oldest rules of the Jerusalem monastic community, but it's not a complete Synodos as we know it. It has just a selection of texts. And the point is that when Van Sleben went in Rome after copying the Orientale 148, the present Orientale 148, he had occasion of seeing the well-known Borgiano Etiopico II, which was at the time in Santo Stefano. And in Santo Stefano in Rome, there was also another manuscript of the Synodos, already at the time at the Vatican Library, the Vatican I. But the Vatican I is just a copy of the Laurenziano. That's interesting. So at first, Van Sleben found more or less the same incomplete manuscript. And only later, in Santo Stefano, he was able to touch and really have evidence of a complete manuscript of the book of the Synods. And in this manuscript, Magliabecchiano Terzo II, we have really the evidence of his attempts at reconstructing physically the complete series of texts as it had to be in the Synodos, because he inserted the pages and he reconstructed, remolded, so to say, the sequence of texts in order to have the text, as he thought, it had to be based on the evidence of the Borgiano Etiopico II. In his conspectus, so in this work where he gives the overview of what he was ready to print, as you can see, the Book of Synods takes by far the great majority. So this opusculum is just 23 pages, and 20 pages are taken by description of the Book of the Synods. And then there is Magna Pars Veteris Testamenti Ethiopici, is a great part of the Old Testament, an Ethiopic dictionary, a codex of liturgies, a report on Egypt, the history of Ethiopia, and so on, and linguistic works as well. And of this Book of Synods, he gave also a detail. So we have the Epistle of Zara Jacob, the Constitutions of the Apostles, and so on. Well, the councils, and I will have to run because rightly Martina is right, I'm running completely out of time. And I was just to say It would be interesting to comment all the experts where Van Sleben says exactly his experience in finding what he was missing. And these quotations are enlightening. But really, we don't have so much time. However, in the Conspectus, there are also very interesting statements concerning the theology of this work and the reasons which Van Sleben adduced for his conversion. So he says, this book of the Synods has enlightened me that the Lutherans are completely wrong and the Ethiopians are right. And he mentions a series of points where there is evidence that, let's say, what he was due to do was completely senseless. And that in fact, the primacy, for example, of Peter is acknowledged by the Ethiopians, and that they have devotions towards the dead, they have prayer, the liturgy is done according to certain ways, and so on. I have to skip everything. And it would be interesting to deal with the, let's say, I don't know how to describe it, really the harsh treatment which Ludolf gave to Van Sleben, describing him with a man without any competence and any kind of reliability. But anyway, you'll have to read it yourself if you want. And he did this in two particularly places. One is the second edition of his lexicon, and the other one is the little known, but very important for the preface, English second edition of his Historia Ethiopica. There are two editions of the English editions of the Historia Ethiopica, and the second one has a long preface, and there he, so to say, makes justice of all his opponents and critics in the way Ludolf was used to do, and he disposed of everything. It's interesting that while condemning him, he says that really Van Sleben could not be corrected. He says, I washed an Ethiopian. I wish he did not appear black before the divine tribunal. These are the words which Ludolf used against Van Sleben. And it is interesting for those who are interested in the topos, this book by Federico Faloppa, Sbiancare un Etiope, La costruzione di un immaginario razzista, which shows the development of this motive, which was very much developed since pre-Christian antiquity throughout the Bible. Sorry? The microphone, sorry. Throughout, so it is found also in the Bible, and Erasmus also popularized it in this collection of Adagia and so on. It's a very interesting history. In any way, so this is the main point which we have to keep in mind to understand this obsession of the books of synods. I wanted just to mention well, always too much. A couple of last points on the durable achievements of Van Sleben. So one is the contribution to understanding of Coptic, because he was the first one, as Hamilton highlights, to state the existence of two dialects, two main dialects, Sahidic and Bohairic. And so he must be credited with this before, a few years before what is normally done. And reasons for his disqualification, aside for his moral behavior, probably due to the spreading of this news of what happened in Chios, is the fact that he was considered a superstitious person. And this might be to some extent true, given his interest towards magic, talismans, amulets, and so on. And also the fact that in those times, just in those years when he came back, there was what Hamilton calls, sorry, I think I have to mention this at least, the affaire des poisons. That is a sort of obsession for poisonments, which was extended to a sort of anti-magic, strong anti-magic attitude, so that probably also Van Sleben was involved in this sort of condemnation. And that's it. It's the last slide, so no. I would say that just as a preliminary conclusion, the contribution of Van Sleben to Ethiopian studies was far from negligible. So he really contributed a lot, working in helping the achievement of printed works, collecting texts, providing materials for others. And had the conditions been different, and had he really had the opportunity of publishing what he could, probably a completely different story would be now the history of Ethiopian studies in the 17th century, where only Ludolf actually is mentioned. And Van Sleben, with his obsession for the Book of Synods, seems to have understood, even since exactly in this book the reasons for his conversion were rooted, that the Ethiopian Church really preserved in those writings a very ancient stock. That, as we always say, but we have to repeat and repeat it, so the Ethiopian Church is not only an Eastern church, it's an ancient church, and it has preserved a very archaic liturgy. And so to an extent that really we hardly still realize. So I would say that in pointing towards this direction, there is the most important seminal contribution of Van Sleben to Ethiopian studies, in my views. Sorry for having been so confused and desultory, but anyway, thank you for your attention.
Do you have some questions? Please don't the microphone. It's not turned on? No? Si sente?
Thank you. Just have a question about the Ethiopian manuscript Van Sleben collected. I think most of them from Egypt. So from this collection can we imagine certain type of the Ethiopian library in the church itself? So when we got a lot of Coptic manuscripts to construct the system of the Coptic library, the churches. We do the same with the Ethiopian library because Van Sleben had never been in Ethiopia, just collected the Ethiopian manuscript from outside, which would serve the interests of the Ethiopian community outside Ethiopia itself. Other visit of Van San Anthony Monastery, do we have any traces of this visit in the monastery itself? Because at this time, the monastery and a lot of documents have been discovered the last 2 years, so we don't have any traces for this visit. Thank you.
Well, if I understand it correctly, the first question was about what we can learn about libraries from what Van Sleben copied, isn't it? So I don't think that we can get an idea of an average library, because really he picked up here and there what he could. But for example, the existence of still recension of the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles without a model is an interesting indication of the spread of some works at a certain time. We should give also more details. For example, for one of the collection of miracles of Mary, copied in Egypt, we know that probably the manuscript came from Jerusalem. so Egypt was actually, as is well known, in the middle. And but I wouldn't say that we can say much more than what simply the texts tell us. And concerning the second point, sorry, I forgot it. It was about... yes. Well, maybe we should ask those who visited St. Anthony if there is any kind of trace of, I don't know, of traces of Van Sleben's visit in St. Anthony in the collections there.
No, but I need to check next time.
Thank you, Alessandro. This is also the occasion to see the two sides activity of Barcelona, that is the Coptic one and the Ethiopic one. Now, it's about the Coptic, about the l'histoire. I'm very interested in the Italian translation. Is it a real translation or is it the original? It would be very interesting to understand this.
No, I can only say I just make the first survey of the manuscript, but really I am not, I didn't go in depth in having a sort of comparison. But this would really be the subject for maybe a PhD dissertation or of a focus study. So if there are people interested here, I think there is really a lot of things to do. And what I can say is that Hamilton, who is the one who has not yet done everything, but certainly is the one who has done most, says that Van Sleben, again, was not lucky in having a publisher who didn't use Arabic and Coptic characters, because from the manuscript we see that he was quite conversant not only with Arabic, as we know, because he was extremely fluent, and this was also one of the reasons because he was because all the others in the East were so hostile to him. Because as a dealer in manuscripts, through Arabic he could do much more. But he was also quite advanced in Coptic, and this is documented only through, of course, not the printed Histoire, because there is no Arabic and no Coptic, but we see this from his manuscript notes, so from his other manuscripts. Yeah, so something to be done again.
Other questions, maybe? Yes.
Thank you very much for this absolutely wonderful. My question is, apart, Ethiopic manuscripts and Coptic manuscripts and all these things, Van Slem collected as well ancient Egyptian manuscripts, or not at all?
Not at all. So he copied some Egyptian monuments in his reports, and particularly availing himself of the help of Iatro, as I said. And this has been the subject of Egyptological interests also in a number of publications which have appeared. By the way, in the website which I showed you, you have also a bibliography on Van Sleben, which is not complete, I have to say, but still it is to some extent a very good starting point. But there have been a few contributions even in relatively recent years which have exploited his notes and the drawings for his works from the Egyptological point of view. But at the time, of course, he was in connection with Athanasius Kircher, and the understanding of the Egyptian was, say, very far from being able to say anything on the writing.
So thank you so much. I think it's time to say thank you to Professor Baouzi for this incredible presentation. Thank you very much. And okay, it's my bad, but the address that I gave you for the reception for those who are joining us is not correct. So we will meet only for those who were invited by the École Française de Rome at the Palazzo Farnese, okay, and not at the other building in Piazza Navona. So all my apologies for that. And for the other persons that want to join us tomorrow, please come at 9 at the École Française de Rome in Piazza Navona 62. So thank you very much again.
Thank you.